Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing a book by P.H. Matthews called Linguistics. This is part of the very short introduction series. This series aims to do very short introductions to a wide variety of topics, and I saw this in my library and thought it would be very interesting to pick up and read. I have not done a lot of reading on the field of linguistics, but it is a field that interests me, so I decided to check out this book and see what I could glean from Linguistics by P.H. Matthews. So I'm going to talk about what's in this book, the contents of this book, and what you can expect if you get this book out of the library or if you purchase it, as well as some thoughts and opinions and things that I found interesting from this book. So let's dive in. One thing about these very short introduction books is that they move very quickly. So due to the nature of the setup, it's going to be a brief introduction. We're going to move through a wide variety of topics very quickly, and that is indeed what the author of this book does. So the contents section, you can see exactly what is contained. The first just discuss linguistics and what it is. That's chapter 1 called The Study of Linguistics. Linguistics is the study of language, and that is, as you probably imagine, a very broad field. So the author takes some time to break down what is going to be discussed in this book. Moving on to chapter 2, Homo Loquens. I hope I've said that correctly. You can see it here. That is discussing how language arose in humans. Now, this is something that can't be scientifically ascertained, I guess you could say, in the sense that we don't have time travel to go back in time and actually see how language developed among humans. But P.H. Matthews takes some time to talk about different theories and different thoughts. And I think that this is one of the areas where the author shows his skill, because it's very clear that in a field like this, where there's not an ongoing, there's not the ability to observe directly, there could be a lot of theories on how language arose in humans. So I think the author does a good job explaining maybe likely theories and straying away from perhaps controversy, because I think that within a field like this, there are probably a lot of competing ideas. The third chapter is language in time and space. The fourth chapter is language families, and this is, of course, what many of us are familiar with. If you are a native English speaker or if you've learned another language, you probably know about the language family that you are working in. They have charts like this. English is an Indo-European language, of course, and you can see which languages are more closely related to other languages. So the language families is probably self-explanatory, but still interesting. That was probably the section that I knew the most on going in. I was already familiar with different language families just because I have done some foreign language study, and most people are familiar with the language family that the language that they are native in belongs to, and as a native English speaker, that is Indo-European. And then we have other chapters 5, 6, and 7 in praise of diversity, so discussing other languages and different features in other languages being not the language of English, which is the language that this book is written in. What is a language? So what precisely makes up language, which is a much more philosophical question than I think most of us appreciate. And how much is systematic? Then we have 8, which is sounds, which discusses a lot of the IPA phonetic alphabet. So maybe you've seen those funny symbols with regard to how to pronounce a word. That's covered in chapter 8. And 9 is the most scientific, at least in my opinion, language and the brain. That was the chapter that discussed, again, language and the brain. I guess it's self-explanatory, and that was the chapter that I spent the most time in. So I want to make very clear, don't let the size of a book like this fool you. This book took me several hours to work through, because even though it is a very short introduction, it goes very quickly, and as you can tell from the contents, it covers a wide variety of topics. So please be prepared to take a bit of time to work through each of these chapters. I think, again, as we're covering a wide variety of topics, you are going to find that certain chapters are more interesting to you than others. I know that for me, I found certain chapters and certain sections more interesting than other sections of the book, and that's just natural when covering such a huge field like linguistics and trying to hit a wide variety of topics very quickly. So now I want to dive into things that I found interesting, or what I found most interesting about this book. One of the problems with this very short introduction series is right there in the title. It's a very short introduction, and I have read other very short introductions such as the history of mathematics, game theory. So you're moving very quickly and you're covering a wide variety of topics. And the problem comes when you hit something interesting and the authors just move on very quickly, which makes sense. I find that when I want to explore if I'm interested in a topic, I will get a smaller book out, if that makes sense. A book under 200 pages, an introduction style book, a very short introduction book, just to see if it's a topic that is interesting to me and worth exploring more. And the problem with books like that, I say problem because it's built into the nature of the book, is when I find something that's interesting that I want to read more about, that I want to check out several books on, the authors move on very quickly and I'm like, wait, that was interesting to me. I want to learn more about it. So it is just built into the nature of a book like this, a very short introduction, but it is something that makes me pause and say, I want to read more about that. But that is, in my opinion, the book doing its job, the book exposing me to a wide variety of other topics within the field of linguistics that I can then go explore on my own. This is not intended to be a comprehensive guide to linguistics. It's not intended to cover every topic in detail. This is just to get me interested and see what else I might want to read about. The two things I thought were most interesting in this book and that appealed to me was first, evidentiality. This was actually a topic that I had heard of before. I believe it was in the language game. There's several other books on a language linguistics playlist on my channel, and one of them discussed this topic, evidentiality. Evidentiality is found in a decent portion of world languages, but it is not found in, say, English, which is one of the major world languages, and therefore it's not as well known. I don't know what other major world languages. I know there are 8 of the most widely spoken, which make up English, French, Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, German, I think, is up there. So we have some big languages that most people in the world speak or are familiar with, or a very large portion of the world speak and are familiar with. And I don't know if any of those major world languages have evidentiality. So many of us aren't familiar with this. But in a lot of other languages that maybe are less well known or have a smaller speaker base, the speaker has to indicate how they know what they are saying. So if you were telling someone that someone got burned, you have to say with a grammatical tense or a grammatical marker. Again, I'm not an expert in linguistics, so I might be saying the wrong word here, but there has to be a grammatical indicator to say how you know that information. Did you witness it? Did it happen to you? Did you see it? Is there just evidence to support it? So you have to, and it's not optional, you have to say in your usage of the language how you know what you are saying. And I think that's really interesting. And the author uses this area of the book to explain how sometimes we become locked in by thinking that the language that we speak is normal and that all these other languages are maybe exotic or different or strange, when if we were looking through the world of linguistics from a different language's perspective, then maybe a lot of features that English would have would be quite strange and exotic. So the language which you know and the language with which you study linguistics is going to, by necessity, color the way that you view linguistics. But it's a catch-22 because you're studying language, but you need language to communicate about the language that you're studying. So you kind of have to use a language to study language. And that leads to maybe a little bit of a bias in thinking that what other languages do is strange, when in fact, it might be a feature that is useful or is contained in a wide number of languages, just not the language that you speak. So I think evidentiality, well, a concept I have run into before, is quite interesting, and I think you might find it quite interesting. There is a whole Wikipedia page, and of course it's covered in this book, and both of those explain it much better than I could explain it. So please read this book and check out the Wikipedia page if evidentiality sounds interesting to you and it's not a concept you're familiar with regard to a language that you know or speak. The second is a paragraph that the author spoke very briefly on, and you can see I've tagged it with a little tag that I wanted to return to. And again, this is the problem where the author will say something very quickly due to the very brief introduction and then move on quickly, and I'm like, wait, that was really interesting. I want you to expound on that. And I'm just going to read the paragraph that was interesting to me, and then I'll explain why I find this interesting. So this is on page 32. First full paragraph on the page for those of you following along at home. It says, if someone who speaks English also speaks German, their behavior will be different in this way from someone that speaks only English. There will also be a variation in their behavior depending on which language they are speaking. If they first spoke English in their childhood and spoke German later, their behavior changed as they did so. If eventually they speak German more than English, their behavior again changes. These points are so obvious they scarcely seem worth making, but speech varies across dialects and accents, and the case is much more interesting. I also just want to point out, when the author says these points are so obvious they scarcely seem worth making, I have flashbacks to sitting in my math classes and the professors saying something like, well, obviously, and then writing something on the board that is absolutely not obvious to me as a learner. So yes, maybe it is obvious, but this called to me because actually this is a very personal example. So through the pandemic, I realized that I was sitting at home with a lot of free time on my hands, and maybe I should do something more productive with my free time than watch YouTube videos and scroll on my phone. So I took that time to intensely study German. So this is a very personal example, and I think that's why it calls out to me. And I was able to reach a decent level in German. So I began to think as I read this book, or I read this section of the book, how far into knowing a foreign language do you have to get before your behavior is altered? And in what ways is it altered? Because obviously, someone who fires up Duolingo and does one lesson in Chinese is not going to fundamentally alter their relationship with English. At least I don't think so. I don't think that behavior changes that quickly. I can do one language on the Chinese Duolingo app and not have a massive marked change in my behavior. I also want to know, based on this paragraph, how far into a language do you have to get before, what level of fluency do you have to hit? Because I am not fluent in German at all. I had the opportunity last year to go to a language school to get tested, and they told me I was using their European framework around a B2 level in German, which my understanding is that is like comfortable conversationally. I'm able to listen to the news. I'm able to listen to other speakers in German and comfortably be able to understand all of that, but I do have trouble expressing more complex thoughts naturally and fluidly in German. So I'm by no means fluent in the German language. Do I have any marked changes in my behavior? What are those marked changes in my behavior? How has my English changed with regard to knowing German? Do I structure sentences differently? This opens up a whole new world. At what level in my language learning journey does my behavior change? Does it make a difference that I learned German as an adult? Does it make a difference that I learned German in my mid-20s? Does that make a difference? Does it make a difference that I don't hear or use German on a daily basis necessarily? This paragraph opens up a whole flood of questions. Does it matter that the language is in the same family that I am in? So if we go back to the language families chart, English is pretty closely related to German. It is in the Germanic family. So in the Germanic family, we have English, German, Dutch, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian. It's a large family. But the language that I chose to learn as my second language, I guess I'm still learning it, I'm not fluent, I don't know if I ever will be, is closely related. Would it have been different? Would there be a bigger change in my language abilities or the way I spoke if I learned Spanish? If I learned something that was really far away like linguistically from my language, like Korean or Japanese? What if I had learned that language as a kid? I'm just spewing questions, and all of these came up, and I was like, wait, I want to know a lot more about that paragraph, and this author just moves right along. And I think he has to. It's a very short introduction. He can't spend 400 pages dissecting the benefits, the pros, the cons, the behavior changes from learning a second language as an adult. That's not the point, the aim, or the goal of this book. But that was just something that came to mind and I found very, very interesting. And I think that's a question I want to explore just because it has a lot of benefit and tie into my life. I think that it's an interesting topic, it's an interesting question. I know many, many people in the world speak a second language from birth or if they learn it in school. So I'm interested in knowing at the age of which you learn a second language, how that impacts. And I'm also interested in learning how learning a second language as an adult impacts your first language as well. So those are just questions that came up from this book that I'm interested in exploring further. And now I have to track down a book that does discuss that. So if you have any book recommendations that discuss that problem, that question, please let me know. I would love to hear about it. I would love to get the recommendation. Otherwise, I'm just going to have to start doing some Googling to see if I can find a book that kind of answers that question. And I hopefully will find something that's going to scratch this itch that has come up in my brain. If you're looking for a very short introduction to linguistics, I have a book for you. It's this one, Linguistics by P.H. Matthews. I thought it was an enjoyable, fast overview. I think, like me, you're going to find certain topics more interesting than others within this book, so I highly recommend you check it out, that you give it a read, and that you further dive into topics that become interesting having read this book. Thank you so much for watching this book review, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.